He bought a lonely barn for $10. $4 women and a newborn baby were sleeping inside. The auctioneer was down to the barn itself by the time I raised my hand. Everything else on the prior place had gone fast. The house, the tool shed, the 2 acres of fenced pasture along the creek. The house went to a banker from Dodge who never once looked at the walls, just kept squinting out past the porch at the land behind it like the house was an inconvenience between him and what he actually wanted. The pasture went to a neighbor named Holt who'd been coveting it since Earl strung the wire, and he showed up that morning with cash already folded into his hat and a look on his face like a man who'd won something before the game started. The tool shed went for almost nothing to a young homesteader who looked desperate enough to have walked the whole way there, and probably had. By the time they got to the barn, the crowd had thinned down to maybe 8 men still standing in November mud, collars up, most of them just watching now rather than bidding. Nobody wanted a barn without land attached to it. The bank had sold the parcels separately, which was their right, but it meant the barn sat on a deed that carried no grazing and no access to water, and any man with sense could see it would cost more to haul the lumber away than the lumber was worth. The auctioneer knew this. He'd been going through the motions for the last 10 minutes. He said $10. He said it with the flat resignation of a man announcing something he knows won't sell, just waiting out the clock before he can close his book and go home. I raised my hand. Earl Pryor had died in September, 6 weeks past his 62nd birthday, owing more than he owned. I'd known Earl not well, not the way you know a man you've worked beside for years or borrowed money from or sat with through something hard. More the way you know a man you've worked beside twice and bought a drink for once and swapped a nod with across a church aisle on the Sundays you both managed to show up. He was a solid man. Quiet, the way frontier men get quiet when they've stopped expecting things to be easy. We'd helped each other with a fence line one summer, and that was probably the most we'd ever spoken. Still, when his widow sold out of grief and the bank moved on the property, I thought someone ought to stand there and witness the end of what he'd built. That's the honest truth of why I drove 4 miles through cold November mud. Not to buy anything, just to stand there. The auctioneer's hammer came down. $10. The barn on the old Pryor place was mine. I signed the paper, pocketed the deed, and walked over to the barn to see what I'd purchased. I'd been inside it once that summer we fixed fence borrowing a mallet. Good pine beams, a solid frame. Earl had put a tin roof on it 4 years back and done it himself and done it right. You could see the care in the work, no shortcuts. Maybe I thought I could use the lumber eventually. Maybe I thought I could rent the structure to someone who needed it. Maybe I just didn't want to leave it to rot on a piece of ground the banker from Dodge was already planning to fold into something bigger and forgot about. I pushed the door open. 4 women were looking back at me from the dark. The thing I remember most clearly in that first moment is how still they were. Not frozen, not the stillness of people who have been startled. More like the stillness of people who have been waiting a very long time and have learned to wait without spending anything on it. They were arranged in the straw near the back wall. That's the word that came to me then, and it's still the right one. Arranged. Like they'd sorted themselves out deliberately, everyone in a particular spot for a particular reason, making the best use of what space and warmth they had. The oldest woman was sitting up against the far wall with a blanket across her legs, and her hands folded in her lap the way you fold them in church. She had dark hair gone mostly gray, a strong jaw, and the particular posture of a woman who will not let her back touch the wall behind her regardless of what's happening. Beside her, a younger woman, maybe 20 years old, lying on her side in the straw with her eyes open and both arms curled around something wrapped in a wool coat. Behind them, farther back in the shadow, 2 girls, sisters by the look of them, broad-faced, olive-skinned, each with a bundle of their own, watching me with the flat, careful eyes of young people who have been through enough to run out of the kind of fear that shows on the face. I looked at what the young woman was holding in the wool coat. The baby was new, hours new at the most, still that raw, dark, crumpled look. Its mouth was pursed into a small fist of an expression, the eyes swollen nearly shut. It was breathing. I could see that from where I stood. The oldest woman said, "We didn't expect anyone until tomorrow." Her voice was steady, not defiant, not apologetic, informational the way you'd tell someone what time the supply wagon was coming. I said, "What happens tomorrow?" She said, "We were going to leave." I stood in the doorway with the cold coming in behind me. Nobody moved. Nobody looked like they were going to beg me for anything or explain themselves more than they had to. The baby made a small sound, not a cry, something more preliminary than a cry, the kind of sound a thing makes when it's testing whether sound is a thing that works, and the young mother shifted her arm and the sound stopped. The oldest woman's name was Clara Devereaux. She told me that first before she said anything about their situation, the way some people lead with a name because the name is the thing they're sure of, the thing that doesn't change regardless of what else is taken. She had the handshake manner of someone who's used to making agreements and means to keep them. Her husband, Martin Devereaux, had been Earl Pryor's cousin on his mother's side. Martin had worked the Pryor land for wages the last 3 years of his life. Good wages, fair arrangement, nothing on paper because that wasn't how men like Earl and Martin did business, on a handshake and a history. Martin had died of a chest fever in August, 6 weeks before Earl. When Earl died and the bank began the process of settling the estate, there had been some dispute, mostly a paperwork dispute, but a real one, about whether Martin's back wages came from the estate or from Earl's own accounts. And while that got sorted out, Clara and the women she'd taken in were told they could remain in the house. They were given a week when the week expired and the dispute was still unresolved. When the week was up and she still had nowhere to take them, she'd moved them to the barn. The bank's man had seen her do it. He hadn't said anything to stop her and hadn't offered to help her. I listened to all of this, standing in the doorway of a barn I'd owned for 11 minutes. She wasn't asking me for anything. That was the thing that registered first and most. She laid the whole situation out in plain terms, her husband's death, the wage dispute, the week in the house, the move to the barn, without a single phrase designed to pull at me. No trembling in the voice, no reddening of the eyes. She had the manner of a woman who spent enough time explaining herself to people who might or might not help that she's learned to take out all the decoration and just give you the facts. Either you'll do something or you won't. Sympathy isn't the variable. The young woman with the baby was Ruth Devereaux, Clara's niece by marriage, Martin's brother's daughter. She'd come with Clara from the Pryor place and had no husband and hadn't offered to explain why, and I hadn't asked. The two sisters were Inez and Dora Pacheco, daughters of a Mexican rancher named Augusto Pacheco, who had died the previous winter of something that started as a cough and became something worse inside a month. Their mother had died 2 years before that. When Augusto died, the land, what little remained after his debts, was absorbed by a neighboring operation, and the girls had no one. They'd found their way to Clara in some fashion she described briefly, and with a kind of protective brevity, just saying she'd met them on the road, and they'd needed somewhere, and that was that. And the inflection of it said she didn't plan to expand on it. Dora was 14. Inez was 16. They were watching me from the back of that barn like two people who'd learned a long time ago that the next thing that happened to them was going to be decided by someone else, and who'd developed the patience of people who understand that truth without being broken by it. I asked Clara how long Ruth had been in labor. She said Ruth had started in the night, 2 nights back, and the baby had come before dawn that morning. It was past 2 in the afternoon. Ruth looked like what she was, a woman who had delivered a child without a doctor or midwife or anything softer than straw beneath her, and who had been awake for most of 2 days, and was now lying in a cold barn in November holding the result with both arms. I said, "All right." Clara looked at me. I said, "You're not going anywhere in this cold with a newborn." I said it the way I'd say the ground is frozen or the creek's running low, a condition of the situation, not a position I was taking that required argument. "My place is 4 miles north. I'll bring the wagon around. You'll come to the house until she's strong enough to travel." Clara said, "We can't pay you." I said I didn't ask. She looked at me again with that measuring look, not mistrust, not exactly. More like a craftsman checking the plumb on something before committing their weight to it. Then she nodded once, clean and final the way a practical person agrees to a practical arrangement. I went to get the wagon. I had 160 acres along Pawnee Creek. Good land, not the flashiest ground in that part of Kansas, not the richest soil, but reliable, well-watered, and mined in a way that nothing has ever been mined before or since, a particular way that comes from having built something with your hands from nothing. I'd come to that country in my late 20s with a mule and a saddle, and about $40, which was everything I had after 2 years driving cattle up from Texas. I'd worked a neighbor's ranch for 3 years, learned how that land behaved through different seasons, saved what I could, bought my section when the price was right, and built on it piece by piece. The house came first, rough and small, and then better as I had the time and money. A good well. A barn bigger than the one I'd just bought. A bunkhouse I used maybe once a year, when I needed extra hands during roundup, and the rest of the time left empty and dim. My wife, Nora, had died 7 years before. Fever, the same as Martin Devereaux, the same as too many people on the frontier who died of things that shouldn't have killed them if there'd been a doctor within reasonable distance, and the doctor had had the right medicines at the right time. We'd had 11 years together. No children, which grieved us both in the particular quiet way of people who have accepted something without fully making peace with it. When she died, I grieved hard and at length, the way you grieve when you've lost the person who made the life make sense. And then I sealed the part of me that did the grieving and went back to the work. Not because the work was more important than the loss. Because the work was there and needed doing, and I didn't know what else to be without her. 7 years of that. The ranch ran well. I kept it clean and tended. I didn't much go to town and found I didn't much want to. The neighbors knew to leave me be after a year or two of trying, which I didn't mean as unkindness, and I hope they didn't take it that way. I just found that by then, being with people mostly reminded me of things I didn't have anymore. It was easier not to, and easier became habit, and habit became preference, or what I told myself was preference. This is the man who was driving that wagon back to the prior barn, 53 years old. Hard-working, clear-eyed, no complaint about the life I had. No real idea anymore what I was missing. I loaded them into the wagon. Clara managed the whole operation without being asked. She directed Inez and Dora on what to carry, organized the bundles, helped Ruth wrap the baby more thoroughly against the cold. She climbed onto the wagon seat beside me without waiting for a hand, which I noticed and didn't remark on. We covered the 4 miles in mostly silence. Clara watched the land as we traveled, the creek line, the fence posts, the particular way the pasture rose toward the north and the house that sat on its crest. The watching had a purposeful quality. She was orienting herself to the country, the way you do when you're not sure how long you'll be somewhere, but you intend to be useful while you are. I put them in the 2 rooms off the kitchen. Ruth and the baby in the smaller room, which had a small cast-iron stove. I lit it before I brought them in and got the chill out first. Clara and the girls in the other. I boiled water and found clean cloth. My wife had kept the house in a certain order, and 7 years of living alone had let some of that order go, but not entirely, and I found what I needed without too much searching. I had a book on the shelf, a medical guide Nora had ordered from back east, thorough and practical, and that night I read the section on newborns by lamplight and learned what I was supposed to watch for. The baby was breathing steadily and had taken to nursing, which was the main thing. His color was improving by the time I blew out the lamp. Ruth named him Martin, for his grandfather by marriage. She said it in a matter-of-fact way, like she'd decided it already and wasn't asking anyone's opinion, which I respected. I slept that night for the first time in years with the sounds of a house that had other people in it. I hadn't known I'd missed that sound. The first week was mostly about Ruth and the baby. Clara took charge of both in the calm and practical way she took charge of everything, and what was required of me was to keep the stove fed and the water coming and to stay out of the way, which I was good at. I spent my days on the regular work of the ranch, the herd to check on, the fences to walk after every cold night, wood to lay in ahead of harder weather. I came in at dusk and ate what Clara put on the table and went to bed. We were as careful around each other as people who have landed in the same situation without planning for it. Polite, functional, something settling in. The second week things loosened. The girls had found their way to being useful, which is what young people do when they're not smothered, and there's real work in front of them. Inez showed up at the milk cow's stall the 3rd morning without being asked and milked her correctly, which meant she'd done it before and done it long enough that it was in her hands. She did it the next morning and the morning after, and after that it was simply understood that the milking was Inez's. Dora had discovered the horses. She'd begun standing at the paddock fence in the early mornings, watching them, not trying to approach, not calling to them, just watching, with a stillness I'd rarely seen in a person of any age, let alone a 14-year-old. She had the particular patience of someone who understands that certain things come to you only if you stop trying to go to them. My gray gelding was 8 years old. He'd known exactly 2 people in his life, me and the man I'd bought him from, and had tolerated the rest of the world without warmth. Inside, a week of Dora watching him from the fence, he was coming to the rail on his own initiative. Inside 2 weeks, he was following her around the paddock like a dog. I watched this from a distance and couldn't have told you why it happened. Some people have something with animals that can't be taught. She had it. Ruth got her strength back with the determination of a young woman who has a clear purpose on the other side of recovery. She was nursing Martin and sleeping when he slept, and within 10 days was moving around the kitchen and helping with supper. The baby was loud by then in a way he hadn't been in the first week. He'd found his voice and was using it fully and without reservation, which seemed to delight Ruth in exact proportion to how much it exhausted the rest of us. She'd laugh a little at each full-throated complaint, like his loudness was the clearest evidence she'd had that everything was, against the odds, going to be all right. Clara ran the house. I want to be careful about what I mean by that. Not that she took over my arrangements in any presumptuous way. She wasn't that kind of woman, and she'd have known better even if she had been. More that she saw what the house needed and attended to it, and what she attended to was consistently better than what I'd been doing. The kitchen in particular. I'd been cooking for myself for 7 years, and I'd gotten functional at it. I ate. I didn't get sick. The food was food without ever getting attentive, and there is a considerable difference between the two. Clara cooked with attention. Not elaborate food, not fancy preparations, just what was available made into something you wanted to eat. The first supper she put on the table, I sat down to it and ate 3 bites before I realized I'd been reading the newspaper after 2 bites most evenings for years. I sat at that table until the plate was empty. I didn't pick up the newspaper. She reorganized the kitchen the second week. I noticed it in increments. Things moved to where they made logical sense. Groups established. An order that made you able to find things without having to remember where you'd put them. I didn't say anything about it because I had no objection. My wife had kept that kitchen in a particular order, and after she died, it had slowly degraded into my order, which is the order of a man who lives alone long enough that he stops noticing what's been lost. And what Clara restored was something close to what the kitchen had been when it was properly inhabited. She mended things I hadn't noticed needed mending. A tear in the curtain, a loose hinge on the pantry door that had been annoying me for 2 years without my ever getting around to it. She left a list one morning on a piece of paper by the door. Lamp oil, salt, 2 kinds of flour, the particular thread she needed to finish what she was mending. Not a demand, not an assumption. Just a list, practical and clear, in a hand that was neat without being fussy. I took the list to town that afternoon without being asked and brought everything back. She gave me my silences without comment. That was the thing I came to value most in those first weeks, though I wouldn't have been able to say so at the time. I'm not a man who talks in the evenings. I never have been. After a day's work, I want to sit and let the day settle, read if there's reading, look out the window if there isn't, be quiet in a way that isn't lonely when you're doing it right. Nora had understood this about me from early on. Some people can live with a quiet man and some can't. Clara sat in the kitchen of an evening, and if she wanted to talk, she said so. And if she didn't, she was quiet, and she never made the silence into something to apologize for or fill out of obligation. I began to understand, slowly and with some resistance, that I had been lonelier than I'd known. This is the hard part to say. I didn't feel lonely. That's the precise thing, I didn't feel it. I felt capable and functional and clear-eyed about what the life was. But there is a difference between not feeling lonely and not being lonely, and I had been confusing those 2 things for so long that I'd stopped being able to tell them apart. You can mistake the absence of the ache for the absence of the wound. I'd gotten good at that particular mistake. Clara in my house over those November weeks began to pull something loose in me. Nothing dramatic, nothing I could have named at the time. Just the slow awareness that the house felt different with other people in it. Fuller, warmer in a way that had nothing to do with the stoves. And that the evenings at the kitchen table were the part of the day I found myself moving toward rather than just arriving at. In the 3rd week, I rode into Caldwell to see about Martin Devereaux's wages. The bank manager's name was Fenwick. Small man, good suit, the practiced patience of someone who has spent years saying no to people in ways that sound like consideration. He had the estate paperwork on his desk inside 5 minutes of my arriving, which told me he'd either been expecting this conversation or was the kind of man who kept everything organized in case a conversation like this happened. He walked me through the documentation of the wage dispute. It was genuinely complicated. Earl's personal accounts and the estate account had been commingled in a way that took real sorting. But the wages themselves were not in dispute, only which account they'd properly come from, and that question, it turned out, had been resolved 3 weeks prior. I asked why no one had informed Mrs. Devereux. He said they hadn't had a current address for her. I pointed out that she'd been on the prior property within his certain knowledge until the morning of the auction, and that he had been at the auction himself. He said he hadn't had the relevant paperwork finalized at the time of the auction. I looked at him for a moment without saying anything. He arranged some things on his desk. I told him I would return on Friday to collect the funds. He started to say something about the complexity of estate proceedings and the time required to properly document disbursements. I told him Friday and looked at him steadily until he wrote something on a piece of paper. I didn't raise my voice. I've never needed to raise my voice to be understood. My father was the same way. He told me once that a man who raises his voice is showing you the limit of his argument, that when the argument is sound, there's no need to. I've found that to be true enough to build on. The money was ready Thursday. I took that as a statement of its own kind. $412. Not a fortune for 7 years of a man's labor and his life, but enough. Enough to move from rather than just enough to survive on. I brought it to Clara that evening. She was in the kitchen at the hour she was always in the kitchen. I set the envelope on the table beside her and told her what it was and the short account of how I'd gotten it. She opened the envelope. She looked at the money carefully, not just counting, something else happening at the same time, something more careful and slower than counting. Then she folded the envelope and put it in her apron pocket. She said, "Thank you." I said, "I didn't do anything. It was owed to you." She said, "You went after it." I didn't have an answer to that. It had seemed like the obvious thing. It still seems that way. You see what needs doing and you do it. I've never understood the people who can see a plain wrong and decide it isn't their particular concern. She started to say something else and then didn't. She turned back to the stove. I went out to see to the horses. That night I lay awake longer than usual. I was thinking about the look on her face when she'd opened that envelope, not the look of relief, though it was partly that, but something underneath the relief. The look of a person who has been told that a thing they'd stopped expecting turns out to still exist in the world. I've seen that look on a man's face when his cattle come through a bad winter better than he expected, when something he'd grieved turns out to be recoverable. I didn't forget it. Finding the girl's uncle took longer and required more patience than one trip to a bank. Clara had known there was an uncle, Rodrigo Pacheco, the girl's father's younger brother, somewhere in New Mexico territory. She'd written him twice, the first time from the prior house and the second from my place. Neither letter had been answered. She didn't know whether he hadn't received them, or had received them and made a decision she didn't want to name, or whether the address she had was simply wrong. Here is the honest accounting of what I did. I had a friend from the cattle drive years, a man named Gus Ellsworth who'd settled in Mora County, New Mexico, and knew the territory the way you know land you've worked for 20 years. I wrote Gus and asked if the Pacheco name meant anything to him, and if he could find me a current address for a Rodrigo Pacheco. Gus wrote back inside 12 days with an address in Roswell, and a note saying the man was known in the area as a solid rancher and a straight dealer. I wrote to Rodrigo Pacheco at that address. I used my own ranch stationery, which carries a return address and looks official in a way that plain paper doesn't, because I thought that might matter to a man receiving a letter about his nieces from a stranger in Kansas. I told him the girls were healthy and well cared for and at my ranch in Sumner County, and that I would appreciate a reply at his earliest convenience. He wrote back inside 3 weeks. He was in Roswell and had been there for some years. He had never received Clara's letters. The address she had was 3 years out of date, from before his brother's death when Rodrigo had been living in a different part of the territory. He hadn't known where the girls were. He had been worried in the way a man worries about something he can't find, not frantic, but a low and constant background worry that a man who works for his living carries without putting down. He would come for the girls in the spring when the roads were passable. He asked me to tell them he was well and thinking of them. Clara read that letter twice at the kitchen table. She set it down and put her hand over her mouth. Not crying, I never saw Clara cry, or if she did she was private about it. But her hand over her mouth meant she needed a moment, and I found something to do across the room and gave it to her. Dora cried. She cried openly and without self-consciousness, face in her hands, The way you cry when something you've been holding very tight for a long time is allowed to be let go. Inez sat beside her with an arm around her shoulders, her own eyes wet and her jaw set, doing the older sister management of her own feeling that she'd been doing, I suspected, for a long time. The baby slept through all of it. This was a talent of his. That evening, Clara came to the doorway of the sitting room where I was reading and said, "You wrote to someone who knew the territory." I said, "A friend from the drives." She nodded. She stood there a moment longer with something in her expression that was close to what she'd looked like when she opened the envelope, and then she went back to the kitchen. I put the book down and stared at the lamp for a while. December arrived and locked everything in hard. The first serious storm hit mid-month and dropped 2 feet of snow, and that was it for travel. Nobody was going anywhere for weeks, and everyone in the house understood this and adjusted. The rhythm that had been building deepened into something more settled. Mornings I was up and out before light. Clara had coffee on the stove by the time I came back in, which I hadn't asked for and she'd never mentioned. It simply happened one day and then continued. Inez had the milking entirely in hand. Dora had graduated from watching the gray gelding to working with him, brushing him out, cleaning the stall, leading him in the near pasture on the days the weather allowed it. And the horse, who had been indifferent to everyone except me for 8 years, was now visibly easier in her company than in mine. I watched this from the fence sometimes without making anything of it. She was a natural with animals in a way that is either born in a person or isn't. If she'd been a boy, I'd have taken her on and taught her everything I knew and eventually offered her a share in the operation. Being a girl didn't make the gift different, just made it harder for her to build a life from it, which was one of many unfairnesses in the world I had no remedy for. Ruth was fully herself by December, and making plans in the practical and purposeful way of a young woman who knows where she's going and is working backward from it. Her sister in Colorado had written twice with money and twice with encouragement. Ruth talked about Denver with the specific and detailed enthusiasm of someone constructing a future out loud, which I came to understand was how she processed things. She built it in conversation before she could fully believe in it. Clara didn't talk about what came after. I noticed this. I noticed it in the way I notice things I'm not ready to name, first as a physical awareness, something behind the sternum, and then eventually as a thought. She managed the house with the same competence and care she'd had from the first week. She was there at the kitchen table in the evenings. She left the silences alone, and she never said anything about where she might go when this arrangement concluded, which told me either she hadn't decided or she didn't want to discuss it, and I didn't press either way. What I can tell you is what those evenings were like. After supper, when the girls and Ruth were in the other room with the baby, Clara and I would sit at the kitchen table with coffee. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. Both were easy in a way that took me some time to understand was unusual, because I'd been alone long enough that I'd forgotten what ease with another person felt like and had started to think I preferred solitude, when in fact I'd simply lost the comparison. There were evenings she'd mend something by lamplight while I read, and the only sounds were the fire in the stove and the wind outside and the small sounds of her work. There were evenings she'd ask me something about the ranch, not making conversation, genuinely asking, the way a person asks when they want to know the answer. About the cattle operation, about how I'd learned to read the weather, about the particular piece of fence on the north side that I'd mentioned repairing, and why that stretch always gave trouble. She listened to the answers with the same attention she'd brought to the barn in February, and I found myself going into more detail than I would have with most people, because she asked the follow-up question, and that tells you something about whether a person is actually listening. I started to notice small things I hadn't noticed in the first weeks. The particular way she stood at the stove when something required attention, a kind of stillness, weight slightly forward, the same posture she'd had in the barn that first day when she was waiting to see what I was going to do. The way she read, when she had a book, Clara read like someone with very little time to spare, efficiently, getting what she came for and moving on. The sound she made when something in the supply list didn't add up, a single quiet note, not quite a word. Small things that you notice without meaning to when you've shared a kitchen table with someone through a hard winter. I'd been a rancher long enough to know the difference between land that's merely available and land that's working, land that's producing what it ought to produce and adding something to itself year over year. You feel that difference in the mornings when you walk out to it. The ranch felt different in December than it had in October. Not because any of the physical work had changed, I was doing the same work on the same ground. But the house was occupied in the full sense, and something about that changed what the work came home to. I thought about this some. I tried to be honest with myself about what it meant and what it didn't mean. I was a 53-year-old widower, and she was a 50-year-old widow, and we had been thrown together by the particular circumstances of a November auction and a $10 deed. And reading too much into the ease of the evenings would be the kind of thing a man does when he's been alone long enough that he mistakes ordinary human company for something more specific. I tried to think that, and hold it and be sensible about it. I wasn't entirely successful. She was a direct woman, not blunt. There's a difference. She said what she thought, but she didn't weaponize it. She'd push back on something I said if she disagreed with it, and she'd do it plainly, and then the subject was done with and we'd move on. I found I liked this. I've spent time with people who equivocate, who soften everything into a shape that makes them harder to argue with and easier to forget, and Clara was nothing like that. If she thought you were wrong, she told you. If she thought you were right, she told you that too, which made the right mean something. One evening in January, with the wind finding the north side of the house and the lamp burning low in that particular way that means oil is running short, she set down her coffee cup and said, "You're a harder man than you let on." I looked up from the newspaper. She said, "You do things, not just the large things, all the things. You see what needs doing and you do it without wanting to be noticed doing it." She was looking at the table when she said this, which was unusual for her. She generally looked at you when she was talking. It told me she'd been turning this over for a while. "My husband was a good man," she said this with care, weighing the words before she set them down. "But he would have had to think it over first. He'd have meant to do right, and he would have, eventually, but there would have been a period of coming around to it. With you there doesn't seem to be a period." I said, "I've made enough decisions over enough years. The weighing gets faster." She said, "That's not what I mean." The lamp made its small sound. Outside, a slab of snow gave way from the roof and fell. She said, "What I mean is that you saw 4 women in a barn you just bought and you saw what needed doing. You brought us here. You went after money nobody else was going after. You found an uncle nobody else was looking for. And you did all of it like it was just the sensible next thing, like there was no particular decision in any of it." She looked at her cup. "I've been around enough men to know that's not common." I said, "I'm not sure it's rare. Most people just need to be paying attention." She said, "Most people aren't." I thought about that for a moment. I said, "My father was the same way, just a man who saw what needed doing." She said, "You're like your father then." That landed somewhere I hadn't expected. I said, "I hope so. He was a good man." She looked at me across the lamp with an expression I couldn't fully name. Not soft exactly, she was never a soft woman, and I'd stopped expecting her to be. But something in her face was open in a way it usually wasn't, like a door left ajar that's habitually kept closed. She said, "I know the difference between a man who does the right thing because he wants to be seen doing it, and a man who does it because it doesn't occur to him not to." She said it simply, without emphasis, the way she'd state a fact about the weather. "You're the second kind." I said, "That's more credit than I deserve." She said, "I don't give credit I don't mean." We sat in the quiet for a while. The wind pressed against the house. The lamp burned down. She said, "What was she like?" "Your wife." Nobody had asked me that in a long time. I told her. Not the obvious things, what Nora looked like, where she was from, how we met. More the small ones. The way she hummed something tuneless while she was reading, something she never knew she was doing and would get embarrassed about if you mentioned it. The fact that she could read a horse's mood from 50 yards in a way I never managed, just something in the set of the ears that she could read like words. How she said my name, just the one word, 2 syllables, but with a tone she kept only for when she was glad I was home, and she always was, and she always used it. I talked for probably half an hour about a woman I hadn't talked about in years, and it didn't hurt the way I expected it to. The way I'd expected it to was why I'd stopped talking about her. But sitting at that table with Clara on the other side of the lamp, it didn't hurt. It was more like setting something down that I'd been carrying in my coat pocket for so long I'd stopped noticing the weight. Clara listened the whole time without filling the silences, and when I finished she said, "She sounds like she was very good." And that was precisely the right thing, the exact right words, and I felt them land. I said, she would have liked you." Clara considered that for a moment. She said, "I hope so." We sat there a while longer without talking. Outside the storm pressed on, inside the house held. After she went to bed, I stayed at the table with the cold lamp for a while. Not thinking anything in particular. Just sitting with the fact that I'd talked about Nora for half an hour for the first time in years and come out of it not diminished, but something more like restored. Like a thing that had been locked had been opened carefully by someone who understood what was in it and handled it well. I cleaned the lamp and filled it and went to bed. January turned and February came in mean. February brought the worst of it. A 3-day storm came in from the northwest that locked everything down past what December had managed. The cold at its worst was a different order of cold, not the kind you hunker against, but the kind that finds the gaps in things, the seams, gets into the wood of the walls and the joints of the windows. I chinked every opening I could find and packed the door frames and went out every few hours through the worst of the second day just to walk the perimeter and make sure the structure was holding. The horses were miserable. I kept the barn stove going around the clock, which was not something I'd done before for just cold. But the cold at its worst will take the will out of an animal, and the will is more than half of what keeps them. The calf was the real problem. I'd been watching a heifer through October and November, knew her first calf was due around this time, and it came on the second night of the storm. Arrived small and cold and already spending energy it didn't have to spend. I got it to its feet and got it nursing, and by midnight thought it was going to pull through. By the second morning, it was down again. I sat in the barn both nights with a lantern. This is what you do when an animal is fighting and there's nothing useful left to do. You keep the straw dry and you watch the breathing and you help it nurse if it'll try, and mostly you just stay present, because leaving a thing to fight alone when you could be there strikes me as a particular kind of failure. Not a dramatic failure, just a small one. The kind that says something about you when nobody's watching. The first night was the harder one. I'd been sitting with the calf for 4 hours when I let myself understand it might not make it, and I had that conversation with myself in the dark while the lantern burned and the wind beat on the barn walls. Losing a calf is losing a calf. It's not a catastrophe. The ranch survives it. But there's something particular about sitting with a thing that's working that hard to stay alive and knowing you might be watching the last of it. You think about effort that doesn't get rewarded, and about what that means when you've spent your life believing it mostly does. I thought about a lot of things in that barn those 2 nights. Clara brought me food both nights. First night she appeared in the barn door with a plate covered with a cloth, set it just inside the threshold out of the worst of the cold, and went back to the house without a word. I ate it and set the plate aside and went back to watching the calf's breathing. Second night, she brought the 3-legged stool from the back room. She set it near the lantern and sat down, and we were quiet for a good long while. The calf's breathing was irregular. The storm was pushing at the barn walls in the particular way of wind that's looking for a way in. After a while, Clara asked me how I'd built the ranch, not the quick version, the full one, how I'd found the land and decided on it and built the house and all the years of working it into what it was. I told her. I talked more than I meant to. The way the creek section looked the afternoon I first walked the property line, the light on the water at a particular low angle that told me this was the right piece of ground. The first winter in the rough house, the gaps I hadn't found yet, the cold that came through in ways that taught me where to look. The 3 years before the ranch looked like what I'd imagined it being. She listened without performing listening. No nodding along, no interjections to show engagement. She was just fully there, attentive in the complete way of someone genuinely interested, and I noticed the difference. By midnight, the calf was more regular in its breathing. I told Clara to go back to the house and sleep. She said she wasn't tired. I said the ground was cold. She said she knew. She was still there when the calf stood up, just before 3 in the morning. Unsteady, all 4 legs shaking with the effort, but on its feet. It took a step, then another. Clara said, "There he is." Just that. 2 words with the tone of a breath released after being held a long time, not celebration, something quieter than that. Satisfaction, maybe, the kind that comes from something being brought back from where it almost went. It was the same tone my wife used to use when something went right after going wrong. I noticed that without saying anything about it. I looked at Clara in the lantern light. She was watching the calf with her face the way it always was, direct and a little weather-worn, no performance in it, and she was simply glad the animal was on its feet. That was the whole of it. The plain goodness of a person who sits in a cold barn in the middle of the night with someone who's watching a sick animal because the alternative is leaving that person alone with it. I turned that over in the weeks that followed, kept coming back to it without meaning to. The calf recovered fully. By the end of February, he was as loud and unreasonable as any healthy calf, demanding his mother at all hours and treating the other animals with the particular arrogance of the very young. I watched him from the fence one afternoon in early March and thought about the 2 nights in the barn, and what I'd thought about in that barn, and what had sat across the lantern from me on the second night. There is a kind of clarity that cold and darkness and long waiting will bring you when there's nothing to do but think and the thinking has nowhere to hide. I'd thought about my life with a thoroughness I hadn't allowed myself in years. What I'd built, what I'd lost. What I'd told myself I didn't need that I had in fact simply stopped expecting. Clara brought me food on those 2 nights without being asked and without wanting anything for it and without making it mean more than it was. That's rarer than it sounds. I've known people who do good things and need the good thing acknowledged, need you to see them doing it. Clara just did it because it was the thing to do. That quality, that absence of exhibition, was the thing I kept coming back to. March was cold and muddy and busy, in the necessary way of a ranch coming out of a hard winter. The ground had the iron stubbornness of ground frozen deep, giving up its frost slowly and resentfully. The cattle were restless after months of confinement. There was fence to check and wood to replenish, and all the small accounting of a ranch that's been closed in on itself for 4 months tallying what held and what didn't. I was out from before first light until dusk most days and came in tired in the good way, the way that means the work was real. Ruth was getting ready to leave. She'd been writing her sister in Colorado through February and the plan had taken solid shape. She had the train fare from the money her sister had sent in installments, and from the sale of the one keepsake she'd carried from her father-in-law's estate, a small silver watch her husband had inherited that had belonged to a grandfather. She'd sold it without sentiment, which told me something about her. The departure date was the 3rd week of March. The morning she left, I brought the wagon around to take her to the depot in Caldwell. She came out of the house with her bundle in one arm and the baby in the other. Martin was 4 months old by then and recognizably himself, round-faced, dark-eyed, and already showing his grandfather's square jaw in the set of his chin, which was remarkable to me, how early that comes through. Before she climbed up onto the wagon, Ruth held the baby out to me. Not to hand him over, just to let me look at him one more time with my hands around him, to let me feel his weight. He was heavier than you'd expect for his age, and warm in the particular way of a living thing that is working very hard at being alive. He looked at me with the focused, deliberate blankness that infants use when they're deciding whether a person matters or not. I held him for about a minute. Then I gave him back. Ruth settled him against her shoulder and looked at me and said, "He would have died in that barn." She said it simply and without dramatic inflection, the way she said most things, as though it were a fact she needed on the record before she got on the train. "We would all have been in very bad shape. You know that." I said, "You're all fine." She said, "Because of you." I started to say what you say when someone gives you credit like that they'd have found a way, that people do when they have to, that I hadn't done anything unusual. Then I thought about Clara telling me she didn't give credit she didn't mean, and I let it alone and just looked at the girl. I said, "Safe travels." She nodded once. She had the look of a woman who has been through something that required everything she had and has come out the other side with a better understanding of what she's made of. She climbed up, and I drove her to the depot and watched the train take her east, and then north until the smoke was just a suggestion against the sky. Inez and Dora's uncle came in April. He arrived earlier than he'd told me to expect, which said something about how he'd spent the winter. The roads had cleared faster than usual, and he hadn't waited once they had. He was a short, deliberate man who shook my hand in the yard for longer than people generally do. Not a performative shake, just a genuine one, the kind a man gives when he's grateful and can't find words in either language that feel adequate to the gratitude. I told him the girls had been good for the ranch, which was true, and which also happened to be something I needed to say out loud, because it was something I'd been thinking all winter without saying. They had been good for it. Inez's milking had been reliable and skilled. Dora's work with the horses had been a kind of education for me in what animals respond to. The house had been fuller and more alive than it had been in 7 years, and some of that was the girls as much as anyone. He said he knew they were their father's daughters, and their father had been a capable man. He said it with the careful pride of someone who has something valuable to account for, and is glad to find it has been properly tended. Inez and Dora came out of the house when they heard the wagon. Dora stopped when she saw her uncle, and then walked toward him, and he went to her, and they held each other for a long time without any words. Inez shook his hand and then let him hug her in the manner of a young woman who doesn't usually accept that kind of thing, but makes an exception when the occasion requires it. Before Dora got into the wagon, she went to the gray gelding. She didn't say anything to him. She walked up to the fence and put her face against the side of his neck and stood there with her eyes closed for about 10 seconds. He was completely still. He wouldn't have been still like that for anyone else on earth, I can tell you that. When she stepped back from the fence and turned toward the wagon, he put his nose once against the palm of her open hand, gently, and then stood watching while she climbed up. Inez shook my hand, deliberate grown-up like a woman twice her age. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Hames." It was the first time she'd used my name. I said, "You take care of your sister." She said, "I always have." The wagon went down the drive and around the bend and was gone. Clara had come out of the house when she heard the wagon leaving. She stood beside me in the yard and we watched the road after the wagon had gone. The spring light was doing what it does in April after a hard winter, flat and clean and particular. The kind of light that makes edges sharp again, that makes you see the shapes of things you've been looking at for months. The creek line in the distance had its new willows coming. The low ground along the water was the first real green. She said, "The house is going to be quiet." I said, "It was quiet before." She said, "You were alone before." I said, "That's right." We stood in the yard for a while longer. The gray gelding was at the paddock fence watching the direction the wagon had gone. I didn't say anything about that. After a while, I turned to face her. She was still looking out at the road, arms crossed in the way she stood when she was thinking something through. I said, "You don't have anywhere you need to be." She said, "That's true." I said, "I've been thinking about that." I stopped and started again because the first start wasn't right. I want to say this plainly because I've never been good at saying things sideways. I'd like you to stay here, not because you've got nowhere else to go, though that's the situation and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but because these last 5 months have been, I found it, better than the 7 years before them, and I'd like more of that. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that I started to wonder if I'd said it wrong or said it at the wrong time, or read something into the evenings at the kitchen table that wasn't there. Then she said, "You know I'm not easy to live with." I said, "You've mentioned that." She said, "I mean it." I said, "So do I when I say I'm not either." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, the shape that comes just before a smile, the first unlocking of it. She said, "I know the difference between someone making room for me because there's nowhere else and someone wanting me here." I said, "I know you do." She uncrossed her arms. She turned toward me and stepped forward, not fast, measured, the way she did everything, and she reached across and put her hand over mine where it rested on the top rail of the paddock fence. Set it there, warm and dry and without ceremony, and left it. I looked down at our hands on the fence rail. I thought about a $10 barn and November mud, and the cold coming in behind me and 4 women in the dark arranged in straw like they'd already decided they weren't going to ask for anything. I thought about a wagon seat and 4 miles of silence, and a woman orienting herself to land she didn't know. I thought about a kitchen put back in order, and a list of supplies by the door, and the first supper I'd eaten to the end of the plate in years. I thought about evenings with the lamp between us and the ease of silence between 2 people who don't need to fill it. I thought about talking about Nora for half an hour, and coming out of it lighter than I went in. I thought about a cold barn in February and 2 words spoken with all the feeling in the world in them and none of it performed, and a calf on his feet at 3 in the morning. I thought about Earl Pryor. I thought about a man who built something from nothing and died owing more than he owned, and the auction in the mud, and the fact that I'd raised my hand not because I wanted a barn, but because someone ought to witness the end of what he built. And I thought about how that $10 impulse, that witness-bearing, that inability to let a thing just disappear without someone standing there, how that was the same quality that made me walk into the barn instead of just pocketing the deed and leaving. The same quality that sent me to Caldwell to knock on a bank manager's desk. The same quality that put me on that stool in the barn in February. My father had it, I had it. It wasn't something I'd chosen exactly. It was more like a direction I defaulted to, a grain in the wood. And Clara had seen it, not because I'd shown her. I hadn't been trying to show her anything. She'd just been paying attention the way she paid attention to everything, all the way, and she'd seen it. And she'd said so, plainly, without sentiment, the way she did everything. That is not a small thing for a man to be given. I had spent 7 years being very good at a certain kind of life. Hard-edged, self-sufficient, clear-eyed about what was there and what wasn't, no one to answer to and no one to ask anything of me. I had been good at it, and I had told myself I preferred it, and I had believed that. I had really believed it, the way you believe something when there's nothing available to compare it to. But preference and resignation look the same from the inside when you've lived with one long enough and forgotten the other existed. Her hand was warm and dry on mine. She didn't move it. She was looking out at the road and the greening fields with that particular look she had when she was simply present in a place, not performing presence just there. The fields in front of us were coming green, the first real green after the long white winter, and the road was empty and the house behind us was quiet in the way. A house is quiet when it belongs to the people inside it, not just the one person. The gray gelding at the fence had stopped watching the road. He'd turned and was grazing along the paddock rail in the spring light. The willow down by the creek had its first pale green on it. Above the ridge, the sky was the particular blue that comes after cold, clean, and without ambiguity. I didn't say anything more. I didn't have to.